There is something about stuffed animals that still intrigues adults, myself included. In the years I've been knitting and crocheting, I've made countless toys, many of which I self-drafted patterns for. Their nostalgia and reminder of innocent childhood days draws many of us to these stuffed toys and can sometimes serve as a small consolation in tough times, reminding us, as they did when we were children, that everything is going to be okay. So when I ran across a vintage knitting pattern for a teddy bear, I couldn't resist adding yet another knitted toy to my collection. I was browsing through a collection of knitting patterns published in a series of Australian newspapers in the 1940s, as one does, when I stumbled across a heading advertising the perfect Christmas knitted gift, a stuffed bear. As soon as I saw the image, I couldn't resist making him. I mean, come on, guys, look at this adorable guy. I did have to do some internet digging, though, before I could dive straight into the pattern, one of which was figuring out what was kapik, which is what the original pattern says to stuff the bear with. I ended up discovering that kapik, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, grows on trees and is kind of like cotton and is used to stuff pillows and the like, so this would be the equivalent of our modern-day polyester stuffing used for toys. Because this pattern was published not only in the 1940s but also in Australia, I then had to figure out what would be both the American or metric and modern equivalents of these needles and yarn weight. After hunting around two sites that so clearly chart out both historical and vintage needle and yarn sizes, I highly recommend them, and I'll link them down below. I estimated that the original pattern calls for what we would now consider 3mm needles and a sport weight yarn. The pattern calls for a wool yarn, but what I found interesting is that it includes a note explaining that if you can't afford wool yarn, you can use tinkle yarn and then brush the pieces out to make it furry. I thought this was so cool because today, knitters use this same method of brushing out budget-friendly yarns to give the yarn a halo. So I took that route and used up an acrylic wool blend yarn that I had lying around in my stash. The pattern is worked from the bottom up and begins with the body of the bear, which is knit in 2 pieces and seamed together. Start by casting on 7 stitches and then knit 18 rows back and forth. The pattern originally has the bear knit in garter stitch, which is knit every row, but I personally prefer the smooth look of modern knitted toys, so I opted to work in stockinette stitch for the bear, which is knit 1 row, purl 1 row. I actually have translated this pattern into modern knitting terms and have published it for free on my blog, so if you'd like to make this bear for yourself, definitely check that out, and I make the note there that you can knit this in either garter or stockinette. Then it's time to increase for the width of the bear. In the first stitch of every row, we increase. The pattern didn't specify which type of increase to use, so I just decided to knit in the front and back of each stitch, knit across, and then purl in the front and back of each stitch and purl across. This method actually worked quite well. Once you have a total of 13 stitches on your needle, you cut off the yarn and leave those stitches on hold. Then you pick up stitches on the cast-on edge and repeat the same steps as before. Again, I have written these down on my blog, so if you're following along, check out the steps there. Now we're going to make the join for the leg hole and then proceed with one half of the body. To do so, you pick up the stitches you put on hold and knit across, making your stitch count 26 stitches. So now you're combining those set of stitches to make one row. This is actually making the opening for the legs, so we're knitting one side of the body at a time. Then you're going to alternate between a series of knitting across and increasing to widen the bear's body even more. Once we've knit the belly section, we're going to make an armhole similar to how we knit the leg. You start by knitting 13 stitches and set them aside because this is going to be half the chest. Cast on 4 stitches for the armhole and then knit the remaining 13 stitches. Then you're going to alternate between a series of knitted rows, decreases, and increases to form the armhole before setting those stitches aside. You'll go back to those first 13 stitches you put on hold and repeat the same steps of increases and decreases before finally joining all the stitches back together just like you did for the legs. Again, if you want the step-by-step instructions for this part, it's written up in my blog. And here's where I'm going to knit across to join those two pieces, as I said earlier, to form the top of the armhole. Once you finish the first half of the body, you'll make one more piece so that you have both a right and left side. Then by this point, it's probably good to take a coffee and muffin break. Here you can see our two body pieces, but even with some shaping, the head will still be a little flat, so what we need to make now is the center of the head. The middle of the head is just a rectangular strip with triangular points at each end, which are shaped with increases and decreases. You'll start by casting on 3 stitches, and then increase in the first and last stitches like we did for the body, alternating with some knitted plain rows until you have 11 stitches. Then you'll knit back and forth for 22 more rows before finally decreasing back to your original 3 stitches and bind off. And that's it. The arms and the legs are knit in pretty much the exact same way, with series of increases and decreases. And again, if you are following along and want the exact pattern, please check out my blog post below. And then for the ears, you basically just make these 2 little squares that you fold over. When we have all our pieces completed, the pattern instructs us to iron them so that they will lie flat, making sewing easier. Now, I'm using a wool acrylic yarn blend, and note that heat will not only felt but melt this yarn, so I placed a towel on top of the pieces to protect them from the heat as I did this. Then comes the fun part, brushing out the pieces. For this, I use a dog brush that I got from the Dollar Tree just for this purpose. It's not been used on a dog, don't worry. When you do this, make sure you brush your pieces before assembling your toy, as you're more prone to catching the seams and ripping the toy in the process if you wait until after you've sewn the bear together. With the pieces brushed, you align the 2 body pieces and sew them together, stopping where the neck would go. I prefer to seam my pieces with a crocheted slip stitch, which is what you see me doing here. So here you see our leg hole and our arm hole, and that's where I stopped seaming because now I need to add in our headpiece. It doesn't matter what end you start with, just make sure that the wrong side is facing you, as all the pieces should be when you're seaming, which I did forget to mention earlier. So center this piece in the middle of the head and then pin it in place so it won't move around as you finish seaming. Then you'll continue seaming the pieces, and for the head, I did switch to mattress stitching the edges just because I found it less fiddly than with the crochet hook at this section of the bear. Alright, when you finish seaming, your bear should look something like this. Now I've gone ahead and seamed on one arm and leg here because, to be honest, this was a little confusing as the original pattern didn't provide instructions for it, so I had to do it a couple of times myself before I figured it out. So let me show you how I ended up doing this for my own bear. It's very similar to a set-in sleeve for a raglan sweater, and it's a unique way to seam up a toy, at least from what I've seen from modern knitting patterns anyway. With all your pieces inside out, you'll match the edge of a limb with the edges of the hole you created for either the arm or the leg, depending on which leg you're sewing. Here I'm working on the leg. I first make sure the hole of the leg is open all the way, and now notice when you sew up the leg, you have this perfect foot. You want that foot to be facing you, so when you place it against the leg hole, it's facing the right direction, not this way or this way, but facing you completely. Then align the edges of the leg hole and the leg limb together, find the center of the leg, and join it to the body with either a pin or a stitch marker. Then you can pull around as you're seaming to make sure the edges will be aligned and pin them in place to make the seaming easier. With your pins in place, you can now seam it up. Pattern doesn't say which stitch to use for the seaming, so I went with my default crochet slip stitch, but a mattress stitch will also work. All the limbs are sewn together. You can now turn your bear right side around. You should have left a small opening in the bear's back, and that's where we're going to stuff him. Because the limbs will be kind of small, I definitely recommend using either a pencil or a crochet hook or a spare knitting needle like I have here to make sure you get the stuffing down in all those crevices. Also, a tip to keep in mind when you're stuffing toys is that the stuffing is how we primarily shape the knitted toy, but we don't want the stuffing poking through the fabric. So stuff a little bit at a time until your bear is firmly stuffed, but not to the point where he's about to explode. Now, if your bear will have safety eyes, this is the point where you'll want to go ahead and add them before sewing up the back. I completely forgot that I wanted to add safety eyes rather than sew them as the original pattern suggested because I was so caught up in interpreting the pattern. So I had to do a little bear surgery later to insert my safety eyes, as you'll see in a few moments. It still worked out in the end, but save yourself some time and put in the eyes first before closing up the back. Alright, here comes the fun part of all the final touches. When I finished seaming, I noticed that some of my stitches were still a little too pronounced, so I took my brush out again and brushed out the fur, air quotes here, even more. Just make sure you're careful to not snag any of your seams while doing this. You will also now lightly stuff the ears and sew them in place. Then using the original photo as a guide, I stitched the nose and mouth in place with some black scrap yarn. Again, your safety eyes should already be in the bear by this point. I just forgot mine and will add them in later the long way around, as I explained earlier. For those wondering how I did my eye surgery, I quite sadly snipped a few of the back head seams. Inserted the eyes. And then stitched them back together. And with that, folks, our bear is done. I am so happy with how this bear turned out, and he was so fun to make. It was especially exciting to watch how adding his little features helped him turn into what first looked like a windblown Wookiee into an adorable bear. I did end up adding a little facial shaping to his eyes and help shape his snout a bit more, but even if you didn't add these details, I still think he would look super cute. I even added a crocheted cap for him, which the whales, of course, wanted to help him put on. Let me know in the comments if you have any name suggestions. I'm currently calling him Tedric, but what do you think about that? Remember that I have my pattern translation link below if you'd care to make him yourself, and if you do, please tag me on Instagram so I can see what colors you used and how you interpreted this pattern. As always, thank you so much for watching because your time is valuable, so I appreciate that you decided to spend it with me. If you found this video inspiring or helpful, please give it a thumbs up and feel free to browse my other videos and see if a subscription is right for you, because next time we're going to dive into a knitting pattern from the Victorian era, and I think you'll find that interesting. Until then, happy making and God bless, my friends. Like precariously close to the flame there. Both the legs and the arms are... This is like a crime scene of a murdered guinea pig. You see all the hairs all over the porch. My clothes, and over there too. Both the legs and the arms are made in... I find my scissors in here. It's like everything else but the scissors. With a lot of series of series. This could take a while with all the pieces I have. you.